rebroadcast. So I'm going to go ahead and just kind of start over as if I just started broadcasting. But remember, if you've got questions, go ahead and send those to me at Tom Richey. I know there's a chat room on the live Hangout, but just keep in mind that it's hard for me to monitor that and see what questions. So use the chat room as kind of a way to speak to each other. And then, you know, with everything else, you know, just if it's for me or for Chris, you know, we'll see how many questions we can get to. So let's go ahead and get started. Good evening, everyone. I'm Tom Richey, and here with Chris Freiler, the author of the AP Achiever AP European History textbook. I got a couple tweets from people a few weeks ago asking, you know, Tom, what kind of prep book should I get? And you know, I thought, well, I've got this one prep book that I've liked, that I've recommended before, and so I got in contact with Chris Freiler, the author of the AP Achiever textbook. Going to show you Chris real quick. There he is, and he's going to be telling us about this. One thing that you need to know is that I've been teaching AP European history for this is my 6th year doing this. I've been to 5 AP readings. You know, feel like I'm getting a little better at it. But Chris has been teaching AP European history for over 20 years. He's been on the test development committee for AP European history, and he's also served at the AP reading as a question leader and a few years as assistant chief reader. So the guest we've got tonight has been the #2 guy at the AP reading. So if you're looking to get a prep book from somebody who really understands the exam from an inside perspective, I think that you've got a great resource here. And so we are very privileged to have Chris here with us, and he's about to tell us a little bit more about himself and his prep book, after which we're going to open the floor for questions from the audience. So keep in mind, just if you've got a question for Chris or for me, tweet it at me at Tom Richey. Okay, that right there. Okay, so just make sure, just let us know, because we want to interact with you. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to Chris.
Thanks, Tom. I appreciate being invited to be a guest on your program, and I just welcome all the people in the AP Euro community, and I just want to say how much I appreciate all the students who are taking on what I think is a pretty challenging class that has both a good deal of content but also important skills that you're learning. And I have mostly sophomores, but I know there are certainly a good number of juniors and seniors and maybe even a few freshmen who take the course. So as Tom mentioned, we're not that far away from the AP exam. And I think for students who are interested in being successful on that test, this is not too early to start thinking about how you might start preparing for the exam. And I think the idea of a test preparation book, a review book, can be part of your studying. And I think my students, and from what I've heard from other students who use either my book or other books, that it's a very helpful resource to have. So there are a lot of books out there. I'll just tell you a little bit about mine and how I think you might be able to use it to be successful on the test. First of all, my book has several sections. The first part is a strategies section, which gives you some insight into how to approach all 3 parts of the test. So on the test, as you probably know, there's a multiple choice section. Clearly, it's helpful to know the content and have studied throughout the year and you know, be involved in your class, participating and trying to learn some of the skills your teacher is trying to present to you. But also there's some strategizing that's involved in the multiple choice portion of the test. Then there's, of course, the DBQ, which has a pretty steep learning curve, especially if you are a sophomore, because it's pretty specific about how the rubric grades your work. And then, of course, there's the free response questions. So there's basically about 45 pages in the book that go through and break down some of the strategies. And a lot of that is drawing on my experience at the AP reading. So I've been a reader, and as Tom mentioned, in various leadership positions since 1997. And that's been invaluable for me in just helping my own students be successful on the test. And then after the strategy section, there's a content review. And what I try to do in the content review is balance things out. So some of the prep books that I've seen go into a huge amount of detail, some of which I think may be unnecessary and can lead students to the idea that the test is primarily simply just memorizing content. And I think obviously content is important, but there's also the ability to take that content and apply it to your understanding of the material especially in writing. So what I like to think of is this content review section has just about any major topic that could possibly show up on the exam, but it tries to balance that out with not overwhelming students with a lot of detail. So the content review section is probably a little over 200 pages, which means that if you're going to use the book, you should probably not wait until the week before the exam to get started with it. There are some books that focus on how to just strategize the test, and I'm just assuming if you're using my book that you're trying to prepare in advance so that you can break down the studying process and not try to cram several days before the test, which I don't think is a very good strategy. And then the end of my book has 2 full practice tests, and I think my involvement with the test development committee and also in other venues has been really helpful in getting me an appreciation of the kinds of materials and the format, the questions that will show up on the exam. And
now, Chris, can I interject real quick? Sure. Just as a teacher, I just want to know that you know, just as an AP teacher dealing with prep books in the past, one of the biggest problems I've seen is with the caliber of the questions that you find in some of these prep books. And I get the impression that some of the people that write some of the books, like, not to say that they're all like poor quality, but I just don't see the kind of quality control here. So I just want to kind of, you know, emphasize what you're saying there, is that you've looked at these questions from the perspective of somebody who's been an insider on the exam, and I think that that's you know, that's something that kind of sets this book apart. Would I be right in saying that?
Well, I like to think so, and many of the other books, they certainly have merits. I'm not going to bash the competition, but most of those people, I can't even think of one person who's written another book who's actually been in the process of constructing an actual test. So I've had 3 DBQs that have appeared on the national exam. So I feel, based on my experience, that I have a pretty good sense of the kinds of questions that will be on the exam, the level of detail, and the kinds of choices that students will see. For example, some prep books have none of the above and all of the above as a choice, and that's never going to be a question on the AP exam. And also try to including stimulus material. So stimulus-based multiple choice question is where you have to interpret a visual, a chart, a political cartoon, a graph, a map, or maybe some text by a famous author, and then be able to interpret that and then answer a question based on it. And I tried to choose an appropriate amount of stimulus material for the 2 full practice tests. So I think if you have some familiarity with, maybe your teacher uses previous AP questions, hopefully if you look at the AP Achiever, you'll see that those questions are very similar in format. So I hope that answers your question. And then the last thing I was going to say about the book is that the last 20 pages or so is a chronological review. And I think this is one of the most underappreciated ways for students to study. Certainly, the course is not about just memorizing dates, but for a lot of students who don't have a background in European history, many of the events that you studied, you probably have never encountered before, like the religious wars or the revolutions of 1848. And so to be able to have a sense of the sweep of the course chronologically, I think is really important. So if you get a free response question that indicates a time period, let's say analyze changes in commerce from 1600 to 1763 and what impact they had on European society. If you're unable to place the question within the appropriate historical context, you're going to struggle in answering the question. So the chronological review at the end of the book is designed to help students just get a handle on the sweep of the course, both in terms of dates, eras, and then there's a more specific chart of chronology which breaks down different topic areas: intellectual, social, economic life. And I think that's a good way to review and to study, especially the few days before the exam, so that you're prepared to be able to look at a date or an era and be able to identify the major developments so that you can draw on the appropriate material to answer the question.
Okay, yeah, and that's a pretty big deal, and something I've been working with my own students, is that in a lot of cases you don't have to know the date of everything, but then if you've got certain dates like, you know, 1689, 1789, 1914, 1815, there are certain things that you need, so having a reference for that would be pretty helpful. Now, Chris, I've got a couple of questions from Brad, who is an AP teacher. And what he's wondering is if there are tips in this book about creating a thesis. That's what he's trying to work with his students as far as the exam's expectations for a thesis for DBQs and FRQs. Does your book address that? And do you want to share maybe some things with the audience about thesis construction in general?
Oh, definitely, yeah. The strategy section has some examples of how to construct a thesis and some strategies. And then also at the end of each content review chapter, there are 10 multiple choice questions and an FRQ. So it's a sample FRQ, and then there's an explanation of what score the essay received. So I think that's a good way for students to, when you accumulate enough of those examples, you get a sense of what's a stronger essay, what's a weaker essay, what are the characteristics of effective writing. And I think the main issue for the thesis statement is it needs to be specific. Students need to remember not to simply restate the question. So if, let's say, a student was asked something about discuss, analyze 3 causes of the French Revolution, just saying economic, social, and political is probably not specific enough to earn you credit for an effective thesis. You'd need to be more specific than that. So let's say you wanted to discuss political causes of the French Revolution. You would talk about more specifically, and this is just in your introduction, the conflict between an absolute monarchy and a nobility who wanted to check the power of that absolute monarchy. So that would be a much better indication. And then in the paragraph that you were dedicating to that topic, then you can develop that further with examples. So I think that's probably the most important and the main consideration, because in reading essays at the reading, which you know this too, Tom, one of the main problems is oftentimes the introduction doesn't clearly state what the student's argument is, and sometimes it doesn't come until the conclusion. It's obviously much better to be in the introduction, simply because it gives direction to the rest of your discussion.
Okay, and another thing from Brad again, and this is just something, teachers are starting to kind of think about this redesign. They're wondering as far as is there going to be another edition of your book, or is this book does this book already have some things in there that are going to help? Now, one thing that I heard you saying earlier was that your book is more conceptual and maybe less focused on all of these insignificant details, which from what I understand about the redesign, this new exam is going to be more like that as well, correct?
Right. Well, I guess I have 2 responses to that. First of all, the current edition of the review book is based obviously on the current exam. So you won't find any of the multiple choice questions that are going to be for the new exam in there, because those are going to be all stimulus based and they're going to be in sets. So my plan is in the next couple of years is to come out with a new edition of the review book, but that probably won't be out next year. Probably be a couple of years from now. But I think the content review of the current edition of the book could still be used by students effectively. And actually, the DBQ will be somewhat similar in format, as will the free response questions. So I think in the interim, until I get that new edition out, you could still use the review book effectively, just keeping in mind the limitations of the differences in the exam structure.
All right, now one question I've got is from Alex. He's having trouble finding the book on Amazon. So Chris, I'm just going to do a little search here, and I'm going to share my screen with everybody real quick and just kind of just see what we've got here. So let's see. Let's go ahead and share the screen real quick, and just go ahead and take a look at Amazon. Now this book is called AP Achiever, so we just put AP Achiever.
And I think there's 14 AP Achievers, but
now the thing is, the nice thing, now I don't know if this is customized for me, but it looks like this is a pretty popular AP Achiever book. European history is coming up first. So let's see. We see to rent. And and I don't know, maybe this Hangout's just been so successful we've already sold them out or something. So this is just saying that we've got, we've got some new copies, some used copies. So yeah, the thing is, it looks like we've got an issue with just the copies being available, which I would go ahead and tell the audience. I'll certainly, if I've got access to your, if you email me or something like that, tr@tomrichey.net. I can certainly get you information how to get it. Chris, do you have anything to shed some light on this?
Well, my understanding is that Amazon has kept the book in stock, and they've sold it for several years since it came out in 2007. But I have noticed that sometimes, depending on demand, that they may run out and the publisher, McGraw-Hill, needs to supply them with the book again. The other option, and I'm not positive this will work, is if they go directly to the website of the publisher, which is actually Glencoe, Glencoe, which is a subsidiary of McGraw-Hill that handles their high school division, and then they can search there. One thing they can do is search by the textbook that it officially goes along with, which is the Palmer, Colton, Kramer History of the Modern World 10th edition textbook. And that should be one of the ancillary texts that comes up when you search for that book. So I guess I would try Amazon first and see if after time that it pops back up as an available text, and if that doesn't work, I would try the Glencoe site.
Okay, and actually, Alex just sent me a link to Barnes & Noble as well, so it looks like if you don't see it on Amazon, sometimes it's just hard to remember that other sites do exist. So we can, and European history tends to come up first. I mean, this is a good selling topic. So yes, you can purchase this on on there, and keep in mind, like Chris said, this includes 2 practice tests. As well, so it's like you can buy that there, and then there's the, let's see, the McGraw-Hill Education. If we go here, let's see, which that's not what that is, but yeah. So the thing is, even though Amazon may not have it in stock right now, keep checking. But then there's Barnes & Noble. There are other places. There are also used copies. It looks like you can get a hold of as well. Let's see, trying to unshare my screen here. All right, so there we go. So let me go ahead and see what else we've got coming in as far as questions. All right, so it looks like that's happened. Let's see. Okay, now I've got a question from Ethan. What are the best tips to use to increase my chances of getting a 5 on the exam, Chris?
Well, okay, that's a pretty broad question. I would say first is have a plan of how you're going to approach studying. And at my school, spring break is the last week in March. So I tell my students before they go off to spring break is they don't have to, I'm not asking them to spend 7 or 8 hours a day studying for AP Euro, but to come up with at least a plan, because I think that given the content-heavy nature of the course, it's so much easier to break it up into manageable chunks. The other thing I would do is make sure that you know the narratives of major topics over a period of time. So just as an example, rather than just studying major events, look at a topic and trace it over a long period of time. So if we chose political and diplomatic history, so you start with 1450 and you ask yourself, what are the major political theories that start off the course? And obviously one of the first names that comes to mind is Machiavelli, and then you start thinking about secular political theories, and then you can move forward from there, and then you think about how do those theories reflect political practice, administration in each particular era. And then if you do the same thing with the related topic of diplomacy, you think, okay, what's the nature of the competition among European nation states? What are the ways, what are the rivalries, what are the alliances that define each era? What types of political systems exist, empires and nation states and republics in particular eras. Look at the maps of Europe. That's an underrated part of studying, is take your textbook and look at the visuals, including the maps, and be able to say, okay, here's the map of Europe in 1648. Why does this map have these characteristics? What recent conflicts have occurred that help me understand why the map of Europe looks this way, during the Peace of Westphalia? And then you just continue to move forward and look at how the map has changed and how the different rivalries, alliances, so obviously even some countries go out of existence like Poland. Why does that happen? And then trace that topic all the way up to the present day. And what that helps you do is when you get a question, assuming, let's say, for this instance, a free response question that defines a historical era, I think it'll be much easier for you to pull in the relevant content to help you answer that question. And moreover, it gives you a broader chronological context, so you can think in terms of what has happened before this time period that led to the topic I'm addressing right now. And then a good strategy is in your conclusion to start thinking about how this topic will affect something in the future. So for example, let's say your question related to politics was the commercial wars and absolute monarchs competing for power, and the end of that question was, let's say, 1763 or maybe 1789. So in your conclusion, that's a good time for you to think about how these developments might have set the stage for the French Revolution. So even though the question isn't about the French Revolution, your awareness that that is the next major political event really impresses the reader that you understand not just the topic in and of itself, but also the way it fits into the whole sweep of the course, the 500 plus years of European history.
All right, Chris. I have two more questions from some folks. They keep on coming in. But the next question now, Danny's asking, I'm going to kind of maybe modify it because she's asking, what is the likelihood of a question about romanticism being on the test? Now, I would say that's probably a pretty high likelihood, but let me just put it to you. What should Danny be really focusing on when it comes to romanticism while she's preparing for this exam?
Well, I think it's quite likely you'll have a multiple choice question on romanticism. As far as an essay question, there were several years in a row where there was not what I would call an art question. So I kept telling my students, I think there's going to be an art question this year. And so 2 years in a row, I told them that there wasn't one. And then the year that I, went with the third time, there was a question on romanticism. I think in terms of romanticism, the most important thing to remember is, well, there's a couple of things, is how does it, as an artistic movement and intellectual movement, differ from the Enlightenment? And I think if you compare and contrast the two movements, not only do you understand romanticism better, you also understand the Enlightenment better. And I think it gives you a better sense of the emphasis for each one of the two movements. And I think in the long term, one of the important effects of romanticism is it brings in a new approach by artists. So artists traditionally, up to that point, were imitating or reflecting the styles of the past or maybe the desires of their patrons. And I think the Romantics give us the idea of the artist as a bohemian or as a separate critic of society, as an artist who's motivated primarily by expressing their own inner subjective states, their own emotional states, rather than simply connecting to, as I said before, the desires of wealthy patrons or powerful political figures or the church. And I think that influences artists later. So I think it sets the stage for the growth of modern art, where you have a lot of experimentation, and eventually with the development of photography, the movement away from art as trying to represent reality and moving more towards abstraction and challenging and surprising the viewer with different styles.
All right, let's see. And keep in mind, as far as for preparing for the exam, let's see. This is my internet's a little bit slow with this Hangout going on. Keep in mind, let's see. I'm hoping that Danny, you've already looked at my lectures on YouTube. I've got one on romanticism that focuses on the philosophy, and like Chris was saying, as far as understanding the Enlightenment. One of the biggest things I've seen on the exam is that contrast and noting how the Romantics are really reacting to the Enlightenment, and so understanding Romanticism, understanding the Enlightenment, really kind of the same thing for the test. Very important to each other. Now, Lindsay is asking, and I don't know. Like, the thing is, one thing I want to note for those of you who are asking questions, that as far as the whole kind of Vegas thing, like what are the odds of this question being on the test or this? It's just like Chris was saying. He's told his own students, oh, maybe we'll see something about this. But you can't really predict what's going to be on the test. But now, that being said, Chris, are there any topics that maybe they're just from your experience, they show up quite a bit for students who are thinking about maybe it won't be this year, but what comes up a good bit on the exam?
Sure, that's a great question. Well, let me just comment on what you said at the beginning of your remarks, which is about gaming the test. And I think there's a certain almost satisfaction in feeling like you're not a spy, but you're trying to like get into the minds of the people who constructed it. And I found with my experience, I haven't been terribly successful at trying to do that. I think the best thing is to just prepare effectively for the major topics. And it may very well be that you look at a set of 3 free response questions and you don't really like any of the 3. But what I would encourage you to do is take a deep breath, slow down, look at the questions again, and chances are you actually know more about at least one of the topics than you think you do. And take the time, the 5 minutes, to actually organize your response. And you may find that you actually are able to come up with a thesis and an approach for a topic that you may know less about than a topic that you know more about. So I wouldn't panic, first of all, when you get into that particular situation. Now, having said that, topics that seem to be recurring, which, again, don't take this as a prediction what's going to be on the exam this year, but there's almost always a question on social history, and oftentimes there are 2 questions on social history. And the irony is that students find them very attractive. Oftentimes, the question on social history, let's say it's women's history in the 19th century, will attract a huge number of students. Like, so out of 3 questions, you would expect there to be roughly an even distribution of 1/3 of students who choose each of those 3 questions. But sometimes you'll have 60, 65, 70% of students who will choose a question like the one I just mentioned. And then also they perform poorly on these questions. They often have some of the lowest averages of the questions. And part of the problem is because students see the general nature of the question, women in the 19th century, and they tend to rely on stereotypes about that question and don't bring a lot of specific content knowledge. So I would say don't pick a social history question unless you've actually had some good training and you've read the textbook and you've studied and you've laid out the changes and continuities, let's say in women's lives or gender issue, before you actually answer the question. So I'd say women's history, social history in general, is a topic that quite often comes up. You'll probably find a question on a major intellectual movement. So we're talking Renaissance, Enlightenment, Scientific Revolution, and then this period from 1850 to 1914, which is what we're studying right now in my class. So we're talking the big hitters, Darwin, Freud, Marx, and the significant changes in ideas during that time period. That's really modern ideas and modern culture, which begins to challenge the Enlightenment. So that's another topic. They're trying to incorporate more of Eastern Europe on the exam, and usually that means Russia, because most of the countries now in Eastern Europe weren't countries until the 20th century. So that would be another topic that you might want to take a look at. And those are topics that tend to come up fairly frequently. But what they really try to do when they construct the 6 essay questions is try to find a diversity of time periods and topics. So, for example, you're likely to find a question on economics, the commercial revolution, the industrial revolution. You're likely to find a question on, obviously, politics and diplomacy. So if you just, like I said before, study like the entire narrative of that topic and are able to trace the continuities and changes over time and understand how one development and event led to the next, I think you'll be pretty well prepared for whatever questions might come up.
And I think I want to address too something that Chris was saying on that FRQ stuff about not freaking out, taking a breath. I actually did, and I'll do this again closer to the exam. I want y'all to keep that in mind. I did a series. Let's see. Hopefully my screen is shared. Okay, the screen looks right. Hopefully, Chris, you're seeing my screen okay?
Yes.
Or is it okay? Because it was all messed up for just a second. But I did a little AP Euro Q&A series, and one of the things here, one of the videos is called FRQ Freakout. And on that video, I explained to you, really, I kind of put everything in perspective as far as, when you look at those FRQs and you're panicking and you're thinking, okay, what's going on here? The thing is that it really, if you look at some of the sample essays and you see what got somebody a 3, then you can see like, whoa, I mean, I got a 2 or a 3 or something like that. It really doesn't take a whole lot, and you're going to realize, like, wait, I can say a few intelligent things about this. What I typically tell my students, because like Chris, I teach mostly sophomores, is that I tell them that out of those 6 questions, now, you may find 2 that you think are great, but with your luck, they're both going to be in the same set of 3, and you can only write one of them. But I tell my students that, look, if you can write one good essay and then you can write one essay that at least gets you some points on the board, then you're on your way to passing. So that's really important that you don't freak out, and I'd encourage you to just take a look at that video where I just kind of lay it out for you, like this is what it takes to get a 3. I mean, you'd be surprised. You know, we read some really good essays and some really bad essays at that thing, but that's just another resource for y'all. But just, you know, approaching the test with calmness and realizing you're not going to know everything that's on there, but the thing is, neither is anybody else. I mean, there's, you know, a lot of students are in the same boat as you are. Now, of course, this is going to be the last year of the current exam with the current DBQ. But Chris, Nico, is there any tip you can give Nico just about preparing for the DBQ? If there was just some kind of one tip that you might have to give somebody to write a better DBQ, what would it be?
Sure. Actually, we were working on that the other day in my classes, and what I was trying to get them to do is, I think by this point in the year, we've done about 5 DBQs. So we're trying to work on mastery. I think most of my students have gotten down the basic core, the 6 points, and now we're working on seeing how we can earn points in the expanded core. So I don't know how many DBQs Nico has done, but obviously I have 3 in my review book. There's other ones that you can access online. I would just say practice. And if your teacher is willing to read your response to the question, or maybe someone else that you trust who knows the rubric, have them look at it. So I would say it's easy, not easy, but to just do the 6, to just get the basic 6. A lot of students tend to write in a very formulaic way, very pedestrian way. So they'll divide the documents into 3 groups, and then they'll take an approach which is something like summarizing the document, maybe paraphrasing it as an analysis, and then adding the point of view, which is, you know, he may be biased because he is an owner of a factory and therefore he wants his workers to make him lots of money, and then just move on to the next document. So I think the best advice I have is to think of the DBQ as a conversation on a topic, and you can imagine yourself as like a reporter who is reporting on what the conversation is about. So in a body paragraph, what you want to try to do is not simply list the documents in order and then summarize them, is you want to play them off one another. So you want to integrate them as a part of a conversation. So if you, let's say, start with one document that establishes a certain position, if you want to use the next document, which then either agrees or disagrees with it, then try to write transitions that show how one document is maybe responding to another document, or is agreeing with it, supporting it, contradicting it, and then you'll get more of a sense that you're integrating your evidence in a smooth way as part of a conversation that relates back to your thesis. And I would also look at some samples of essays, DBQ essays, that earn at high scores like in the 8 or 9 range, and see if you can try to capture, usually the marker for that is a more sophisticated analysis of the documents.
All right, and let's see. And one thing that I think that Chris really hit on there is when you're incorporating the POV. That's something that most people really struggle with. There are a lot of essays that I grade each year, you know, whether it's my own students or at the reading, where it's a beautiful essay. It just doesn't incorporate that point of view. And you know, he said, like, this person is a factory owner and therefore wants to make more money from the workers or something like that. Make sure you have an explanation. There's one video that I've thought about doing sometime where I just say, he biased. You know, it's just, oh, he's biased, she's biased. Or sometimes they just say biased. They don't even say biased. It's just like, oh, he's just biased. And I find that, you know, a lot when I'm reading, you know, my students' essays initially. And you want to make sure that you're explaining yourself. Don't just say somebody's biased, but explain what that bias is. You know, kind of like when you're writing a thesis. Don't just restate the question. You know, actually go in there and, you know, say something. You know, explain how or why or something like that. Okay. So
I was one of the things I introduced to my students the other day is I gave them a mnemonic device, an acronym. It's not very catchy, but it's PIRTH, P-I-R-T-H, and each one of the letters represents a different strategy that you can use to do point of view. So I'll just really briefly explain each one of them with maybe an example. So the first one, P, stands for purpose. So ask yourself, why did the person create this document? What is their intention? What's the occasion? What's the historical circumstance? And that works really well for visual sources. So if it's a political cartoon or even a photograph, why did the person take this photograph? Why did they draw this political cartoon? What's their agenda? So if you break that agenda down, it shows an awareness that this is not just something that fell out of the sky. It's within a historical context, and the person had a reason for making it. And then the second one, I, is the identity of the author, and that's the most common way that students do point of view. So they'll take some feature of the source attribution, the person's class, their gender, their political party affiliation, and then suggest how that identity might have influenced the way in which they present their ideas. And then the R stands for reliability. So how, as a source, how useful is this as a understanding the particular topic that's in the question? So one example that I think works well is if you have a source that's created many years after the events it's describing, that should be an immediate alarm bell how you can analyze the kinds of issues that come up when people are remembering events that happened 50, 60 years ago, whether that's nostalgia or whether their perception of those events are colored by events that happened in between that time period. So if you have a memoir, I would just say jump on that and talk about reliability. And then the T stands for tone. So not everybody presents their ideas in the same way. Sometimes they're condemning something that they disagree with. Sometimes they're praising it. They're giving a speech and they're trying to persuade. Look at the words that they use. Maybe those words indicate that they're using rhetorical devices to influence an audience. And then the last one is historical context. So you ask yourself, what was happening during this time period that might have influenced or affected why the author is taking a particular position? So those are 5 different strategies, and so it allows you to show a little bit more complexity rather than simply repeating over and over the same thing that Tom was just talking about, which is bias, bias, bias. And you don't have to use that word to do point of view.
All right, now I've got a few questions here. Let's see. Incredible things I asked. I kind of forgot everything I learned last semester. Health. Which you're in luck because I've got a lot more lectures online from the first semester pre-1815 content right now than the post-1815 content is what I'm really still working on. So there are some of you, like, let's see, Tabitha is asking about, Greater Germany versus Lesser Germany. Just stay tuned, be patient. I've got a lecture on German unification ready to go that I'm going to be posting in the near future, and I'm going to be addressing Big Germany, Little Germany, Klein Deutschland, Gross Deutschland, all that kind of stuff, Bismarck. So just stay tuned. That'll definitely be sometime the next month, sometime between now and the exam. Let's see. So then we've got... could you go over the major houses such as Hohenzollern, Habsburg, Bourbon, etc., where they were in control and notable rulers? Which the good thing is now, Chris, I'll see if you would verify this as well. From what I've seen, like the way I explain the Hohenzollerns in Prussia. Now, keep in mind, I've got a video. If you type in Prussian absolutism, you can see my video on what I call the Fredericks, the Hohenzollerns in Prussia. Also, I've got a video on enlightened absolutism, which addresses, Frederick the Great, Catherine the Great, and Joseph II, not so great. So those are there. But one thing I've noticed is on the exam, keep in mind that you really, with the Prussians, their names are either Frederick, William, or Frederick William. And I've never seen a question that requires somebody to differentiate between any of those rulers. Has that been your experience, Chris?
Well, a couple of years ago, there was a question on Frederick the Great, Frederick II, but I think they usually put Frederick the Great. They're not trying to trick students, and I think in the last few years they've, in fact, gotten away from using centuries, because, believe it or not, centuries often confuse students, so they just put, 1500 to 1800. So I think that's one thing that students should keep in mind, is that this is not a trick. The test makers, if they come up with something that you're not sure about or you don't understand, it's not based on them intentionally doing that. So if it says Frederick the Great, then it's probably the most important person that they're going to be asking about. But students do make mistakes and confuse rulers. Sometimes I've seen them flip-flop Joseph and Frederick.
Yeah, and so that would be one thing as far as, Frederick the Great's definitely, an important ruler, and really in a class by himself because he's in there with the enlightened absolutist. And you'll want to, there's been one question before where there was an FRQ. I use this a good bit in my class about Joseph II and Frederick the Great. Now, and then, let's see, I've got a like a question about, some people are asking about the post-World War II stuff, which some of your teachers may be in the same boat as me. I'm really trying hard to get through that content at the end of the year. I made a video in my Q&A series. There's one that I've got here. It's an 18-minute, almost 19 minutes, but it's just AP Euro post-World War II stuff. And what I've done with that, I'm going to go ahead and just kind of show you. I put the outline here. And so for those of you that are just really in a bind and you're like, wait, we didn't really get much past World War II, I just made an outline and just kind of informally addressed a lot of things that are on the exam post-World War II. So if there's if it's a cram situation, just keep in mind that this resource is there. That, you know, it's just, hey, you know, we've got a what's on the post-World War II. A lot of people have found that helpful. And the other question is about how far the exam goes. And it covers, you know, you get through the Cold War, and you've got the EU, and really, Chris, if I'm not mistaken, we're really kind of going through like 2001. They should be familiar with, you know, the War on Terror and that sort of thing, and also we're seeing, you know, with this Charlie Hebdo thing. I tell my students, very important to follow current events in Europe. So, you know, you can see what's going on now in, you know, with France and that shooting, and, you know, some of the issues that they have, you know, just like we've got immigration issues in the United States that we debate, Europe has its own immigration issues, especially with Muslim minorities in several countries. We're seeing, as a result of this, you know, I've been following Dutch politics a little bit, and there's this guy here at Wilders who has an anti-Islamic party. Pretty much, that's their, you know, they've got a multi-party system, and you see that this guy's gaining traction. And so when you're following these current events, you can see that, okay, these are the issues that are currently in Europe. And, I mean, don't obsess over these current events, but at least if something's going on over there, the UK is going to be having an election right around the time of the exam. So, you know, I think, you know, being current is a good thing. Chris, do you want to shed any light on just the most recent things that are on the exam and what should really be emphasized?
Sure, that's a good question. It actually allows me to pick up on a previous question, which you had a caller who asked about the notion of what kinds of essay questions will show up. And I forgot to mention that there's almost always an essay question on the post-1945 period. And then you should probably count on about 8 to 10 of the 80 multiple choice questions being on the post-1945 period. And I think the test makers have been pretty adamant because they do want teachers to get up to the present. Now, your comment about current events, I think current events are great to integrate into the curriculum, mostly because they highlight developments that have occurred in Europe after 1945. So you are not going to see an essay question, multiple choice question on the situation in France with the terror attacks on Charlie Hebdo. But it does connect with the topic that you mentioned, which is immigration. So you will potentially find an essay question or a multiple choice question on the changing nature of European identity after 1945 because of racial diversity. So in terms of if you are crunched for time post-1945, I think it is useful to at least get a lay of the land, even if you don't have a lot of specifics. So I would divide the post-1945 period into 5 major topics. So the first one is the Cold War, which is what most teachers will spend the bulk of their time on post-1945. So you should know the causes of the Cold War, the major course events of the Cold War, and then how the Cold War came to an end. And then after that, I would divide Europe into West and East and look at the development of the Western Alliance, the recovery, the Marshall Plan, U.S. involvement in Europe, and the development of European unity. In terms of how much time to spend in individual countries, I would just kind of triage that and pick out just the most important developments and focus on the more continental stuff, because there's unlikely to be an essay question on a specific country, 1945, that are just part of the alliances. And then I would move over to Eastern Europe and look at the relationship between the Eastern Bloc countries and the Soviet Union, the collapse of communism, and then, of course, those countries being more integrated into the rest of Europe, like the European Union. And then I would turn from there to like economic and social developments, which is recovery from World War II, the development of the social welfare state, changes among different social groups, for example, like guest workers and women and the second wave of feminism. And then the last topic I would look at is intellectual and cultural developments. So further developments in modern art, existentialism, and the ways in which you have like modern ideas or postmodern ideas in culture. And if you can just get the big picture in each one of those topics, then I think you should be pretty well set up for the post-1945 period.
All right, and that kind of, yeah, touches on that a good bit. And I'd say I'd just add one thing with the European integration, and this is something, I mean, the exam keeps evolving. One thing that I'm starting to emphasize a little more with the current events, like Chris said, not anything specific necessarily, but you've got this Euroscepticism that goes back, you know, all the way to Thatcher and other people. So that's good for people to kind of be familiar with some of these, you know, some of these parties that are rising up now, you know, with kind of like the whole Newtonian every action equal and opposite reaction. But yeah, I think that Chris has outlined some great categories for that, because a lot of times, I mean, I know I'm pressed for time at the end when we're, you know, trying to wrap up. So it's good to conceptualize, make sure people go in with something. Incredible things, you're finding that reading that AP Euro textbook is boring. Well, I don't know how to help you with that one, but you know, keep tuning in on these Hangouts, keep watching the lectures. I'm going to try to get more content out there to you. You know, as well as I can. And also keep in mind that if you're, you know, looking at a prep book like the one Chris has written, that those things are going to be put a lot more succinctly. And the thing is, like, a college textbook, like a lot of times I don't even really refer a lot to the college textbook that I use. I actually use a shorter, like, course book that is like by somebody else. But one thing to note is, you know, a lot of times in the college level textbook, there are a lot of professors who are writing it that, you know, they're feeding their egos, you know, writing more and more stuff. But, you know, Chris's book is designed for the exam. So if you're, you know, struggling with that textbook, Chris just explained he's got 200 pages of content, whereas, you know, your textbook may have 600 to 800 pages of content. So if you get a prep book, it's going to have the content simplified and really kind of distilled for what you need for the exam, because these textbooks, typically they're written to accompany a college level course, and a professor in college would a lot of times tell you to read certain things and not read certain things. They're going to skip around and really emphasize some stuff, skip a whole chapter here, spend a lot of time on this chapter. So keep that in mind, that that's one of the biggest advantages of buying a prep book, is that you do have something that here's what you need to know for the exam, and not you know, just smothering you in a bunch of extraneous content. Shout out to Mr. Bringus from Holy Family. So that's great. Any other resource to prepare for the test, Mariana? Let's see, that's, you know, Chris's book, my videos, whatever your teacher's giving you, lots of great stuff that you've got. Let's see, so we've got that shout out. Glad people are watching Game of Thrones. Can we please also...
about the textbook, just one
point.
Yeah,
go ahead.
I understand for some students, their AP Euro textbook is not necessarily their best friend, but I wouldn't just cast it aside completely. One way in which you can use it is to get a connection to the course visually. I brought this up before. So even if you're not going to reread the entire textbook, let's say there's a topic that you don't feel very comfortable with. Let's say, for example, hey, I don't really understand you know, Lutheran theology. So maybe you do go back to the textbook. If you annotated it or highlighted it, I would just go ahead and reread that section until you feel like you do understand conceptually what Luther and the Protestants were up to and what their concern was about the Catholic Church. But then I would also look at the visuals. So this gives you some, because a lot of people are visual learners. So if you say to yourself, okay, what is some of the Dutch art of the 17th century? And if you look at it, I mean, it's not just to prepare for multiple choice questions, to give you a sense of the way in which art reflects the time period in which it was created, how it develops over time. So I think it helps you remember the content better when you can connect it to some image, whether that's a political cartoon or a map, or a photograph or a picture of a major historical figure. So that's a way to use the textbook effectively and to connect it to bigger themes without necessarily trying to reread 900 pages 3 weeks before the exam.
All right, let's see. You know, now I'm still getting tweets about FRQs. We've kind of touched on you know, FRQs and the strategies for that. Now, also, we're kind of, planning to be here, originally this is kind of an hour, which it seems like the questions are starting to wrap up. But if you have any more questions, let's kind of throw out a last call for anybody that's thinking about sending questions our way. But FRQ keeps on coming up, Chris. So if there's anything else you want to share about that, I think that our audience would appreciate that.
Sure. Well, just a couple of basic tips. First of all, get to the point. History teachers, maybe you've learned different styles of writing, is generally the sort of catchy, clever attempts at setting the scene or trying to use like really fancy rhetorical devices don't really end up, in my mind, working terribly well. It's more effective if you just start off by locating the topic in a specific historical context. So, for example, let's say you're being asked to write a question about some specific development or event in the 19th century. So the first thing you do is ask yourself, what are the major developments that have occurred in the 19th century that gives me a context for this question? So, I mean, what should automatically come up, for example, is industrialization, or revolutionary ideologies, or nationalism and national unification movements. And then you say, is that relevant to this question? And then I would start out my essay with the first couple of sentences kind of defining the general historical developments. Then I would answer the question very specifically. So if it's asking you for causes or effects, specifically identify what those are. And then the main thing is, I think one of the ways to distinguish a strong essay is a phrase that we use at the reading: is the student in control of the question? Which means, are you focused throughout the essay on not just showing off what you know or getting out the content that you learned, or demonstrating that you're brilliant in European history, but you're actually answering the question, which has a major concept as its focus. And then for the conclusion, what I would try to do there, because most of the conclusions that I've read don't add a whole lot to the student's essay, is try to go a little bit beyond the boundaries of the question and think about, how does this topic fit in with the broad scheme of the course, and think about maybe something that, whatever the topic is, what it led to in the immediate future, or how it ties in with an ongoing problem or issue in European history, and how this particular topic is another example of that. And if you do that, it might actually raise your score in the reader's mind from, let's say he or she was thinking of a 6, and now you finish strong with your conclusion, maybe you'll get a 7.
All right, so let's see. Shout out to Dennis and Mac. All right, so y'all got your shout out that y'all are bugging me for. Okay, it looks like a few people are responding to the last call. And let's see. Yugoslavia. No, Yugoslavia is not the same thing as Narnia. Let's see. Kind of confused on what counts for added info in the DBQ. Okay, so outside information. Now, keep in mind that for this exam before the redesign, the outside information is like on the expanded course, so it's something that after you get those original 6 points, you can get some some extra points by incorporating outside information. Chris, any quick strategies on just what's good hard-hitting outside information if somebody's really wanting to get that point and make an impression on the reader?
Sure. First of all, the questions on the DBQ have moved in the last 5 or 6 years to more what we would call mainstream topics. Sometimes they were on very obscure topics, so it's much easier to incorporate outside information. The first thing, though, is don't just name drop. Don't just throw out. Let's say the question is some specific feature of the Enlightenment. That's not an opportunity for you to name drop all the different Enlightenment philosophers you know. The main thing is, does that historical context actually help me analyze the document? So if it does help you analyze the document, then I would say go ahead and use it. So this goes back to my previous point. You really need to have a good sense of the chronology of the course. So if a date pops up for the document, you just ask yourself, what in general was going on during this period? And maybe it's something really specific. Maybe it's an actual political event. Like my students did a DBQ the other day, and one of the documents was a German journalist writing in 1913 extolling the idea, whatever the topic was, related to nationalism. And so many of my students just remembered, because I had emphasized it, that the First World War began the following year. So perhaps this person was influenced by the rising tensions in Europe and nationalism, in the sense, of course, that Germany was one of the central countries that was involved in the beginning of the war, to use that as a way to understand what that journalist was writing and how they were influenced by the events of that period to take this strong nationalistic stand. So I think if you study your chronology, that just helps you with all areas of the course, including knowing how to meaningfully and appropriately incorporate outside information when you're looking at documents in a DBQ.
All right. Let's see. I've got a few more questions. Okay, so let's see. All right, DBQs, all of that kind of stuff. Let's see. Being asked, Chris, what's your favorite color?
Oh, I'd say green.
Green. Okay, same as my daughter. I would say blue if I had to pick. Let's see. All right, and we've already given a shout out to Mr. Bringus, but here's another one. Evidently, thank you, Mr. Bringus, for recommending this hangout. Evidently, and also Miss Milkovich as well. So those two. Okay, and so it looks like we are heading up on 10 o'clock. 10 o'clock Eastern. We've been here for about an hour. Is POV going to be on the new exam next year? Yes. Now, POV is not going away. I teach Euro and APUSH. So the thing is for the first time this year, the APUSH exam has POV on there. So the stuff that you're learning in Euro this year, if you're taking APUSH next year, it's been easier for me this year to make the adjustment from the AP Euro to the APUSH DBQ than it ever has been, because APUSH has to do POV. And they're not required necessarily to do groups, but grouping still helps, because Chris alluded to something earlier, that the most important thing to do is to, see yourself as somebody that's taken all of this stuff and you're putting these documents in conversation with each other, that you're bringing them to life, you're putting them in conversation, and you're really getting to the bottom of what's there. So yes, POV is not something that's going away. It will be on the new exam, and it's on the APUSH exam as well. Let's see, POV equals point of view. That's right, Ryan.
Just as all three of the history subjects will have essentially the same rubrics for all parts of the exam. And that was done on purpose. I think the belief was that there's not really a good reason in terms of teaching as to why there's three different rubrics for three different of the same kinds of historical thinking tasks. So for those students who are planning on taking two or more of the three history subjects, you don't have to constantly relearn, unlearn some of this tasks that you learned in one class, because they will apply to all three of the history subjects. So that's a good thing for students.
All right. Let's see. So I think that we've kind of, this has been well planned as far as we're an hour in, and I think everything's kind of slowed down about the right time. Chris, any parting shots or anything like that? Just a last word of advice for everybody. Abigail is asking ways to memorize key info, but if there's really just any kind of thing that you want to say, just to give these kids some tips on preparing, let's go ahead and hear that.
Sure. You don't have to be perfect. I'm not going to get into too much into specifics with numbers, but there's 180 possible points overall in the AP exam. You don't need to know how that formula is started out, but my point in mentioning is you don't need to get all 180 of those points. You don't need to get all 80 multiple choice questions right. You don't need to get a 9 in the DBQ. There's just different paths for students being successful on the exam. And when your score is reported as a 5, that's not going to distinguish between the student who amazingly got all 180 of those points and the student who got the lowest 5, which is much lower than 180 points. So don't try to be a perfectionist. What I would suggest that you do is focus on effective writing skills, study the chronological sweep of the course, and start your studying early and making it much more manageable. And I think that'll probably be the most effective for students who are encouraged and wanting to do well in this test, and not wait until 3 or 4 days before the exam. That's generally not going to. You might hear heroic stories of students who pulled that off, but those are the exceptions, not the rule. So you'd just be best served by having a strategy for how you're going to prepare for this major test.
Yeah, and I think that Chris hits the nail on the head. He's seen this too. They're going to be what I call your TJs. These are people that they come to class, they don't do jack squat all year, and they pass the exam. But every year I've got, whereabouts of 20 students, and maybe that describes one student who's in my class. So odds are you are going to need to prepare. You are going to need a system. There's one student that I tutor that what she does is, and this is the thing, it's kind of like you're going to do anything. If you're going to do a, workout plan, or you're an athlete or anything like that, go ahead and sit down and make a contract with yourself that, I'm going to study this period at this point, this period at this point, whether you're looking at Chris's review book, whether you're watching my videos. Now, some people, if I showed you the data on my videos, like 3 days before the exam, it just skyrockets. And really the day before, it's just like all of a sudden people realize, whoa, I've got an exam tomorrow. But I've got over 40 videos now, several hours of lectures that if you parcel this out, you're going to be able to be a lot more prepared, especially if you're looking to make a 4 or a 5 on the exam than if you just try to cram for it. It's very manageable, but you're going to have some sort of plan for what you want to do and what you want to accomplish, and sort of line that up. So anyway, let's, Chris, anything else for us before we sign out?
No, thanks again for having me on your program, and I enjoyed talking with students, and I just wish them the best of luck on May 8th, which is VE Day. Historically, it's the end of World War II, so that's victory in Europe, so I wish you victory in AP Europe.
All right, so yes, a victory. Just be sure not to do it like this, because that'll offend British people. Just make sure you keep it this way. All right, and remember, I've of course got videos on YouTube. Be sure to watch the ads. That helps me out. 30 seconds or half the ad, whatever. And Chris's book, AP Achiever: European History, is for sale on from various online outlets. And that's a great way to get some prep from somebody who really knows the exam, knows not only how it's put together, but also how it's graded, and has over 20 years experience teaching the subject. Now that we're getting closer to the exam, I plan on doing, hopefully at least a live hangout a month. In March and April, and then when we get to May, you'll be seeing a good bit of me. So thank you, Chris, for coming on tonight, and good luck to everybody. And I'll have some more new Euro videos. I've had a lot of questions about German unification. That is near the top of my list, to get something out on German unification. I'm hearing it, but just keep telling me, because really squeaky wheel gets the grease. So if there's something you want to see, let me know. I'll try my best to deliver on that. Until next time.